What is it?
The main thing I got from it was like this sense of feeling seen and validated.
Well, why does it have to be this way?
This book was placed in my hand for this moment.
Insightful, learned a lot, wrote some quotes that I'm ready to like paint on my wall.
I love this book!
That we just kind of pull out some of the big themes that we see and talk about a few different ones.
I apologize if most of my contribution has K-pop references.
Alternative book title, The Feminine Mystique Part 2. You were really just gay all along. Welcome to Book Club.
With Julia.
And Victoria. We are two girlies that rejected a lot of genre books in our late teens in search of the literary classics. But now we give absolutely zero shits about James Fenimore Cooper, and we're here for some sci-fi.
And we would love to be your book friends.
This is a podcast for the books we just can't shut up about.
This week, we can't shut up about The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Guin, which in certain printings has the subtitle of An Ambiguous Utopia. And it complicates the moral and ideological battles between capitalism and communism. So let's rock and roll.
Whether you have read this book or not, you are welcome here. So just know that there will be spoilers ahead. So if you are on the fence about whether or not that means you want to read the book before listening to this episode, I would say this is like a novel of ideas. Mm-hmm. The plot is present, but I think secondary. I avoided a lot of research on this book until I finished reading, but I think I would have been fine if I would have just gone forward with my research. So that being said, there are spoilers, but take that with like a giant grain of salt that you might still enjoy this episode and still enjoy the book afterwards.
Quickly, if you'd like to support the show, you can rate, review, and subscribe on any and all podcast platforms. If you want to support us a little bit, you can follow the book links in the show notes to our bookshop.org affiliate page. We get a very small kickback from those purchases. If you'd like to join the club, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv for a bunch of fun extra content and to help us save up for a transcription service so that we can make our podcast more accessible. So yeah, welcome everybody.
Welcome. Okay, our author, Ursula K. Guin, was an American writer, best known for her speculative fiction novels and short stories. She was born in 1929 in Berkeley, California, and she was the daughter of the notable anthropologist A.L. Kroeber, and her mother was the writer Theodora Kroeber, known for her anthropological writings as well. And Julia, you are a resident anthropologist on the show. Is there anything of distinct note that we should know about Kroeber?
Yeah, so he was kind of a big deal. He was one of the first students of Franz Boas, who was like the father of American anthropology. He basically founded the anthro department at Berkeley. He was considered a leading expert on American indigenous peoples and languages. Obviously, like all anthropologists from his era, an incredibly complicated figure. But like for a long time, his writing was like the textbook in the US on anthropology.
Yeah, so that's all relevant because, as we'll talk about further on, the novel we're discussing today has some pretty strong influences of cultural anthropology. Ursula grew up with 3 older brothers and very much an academic household. So their parents raised them with like a love of reading. They didn't raise them with any formal religion, though Le Guin read a lot of Taoist philosophy in her adolescence, which she cited as very influential on her kind of approach towards life. And with Dr. Kroeber teaching at UC Berkeley, their home was open to a lot of distinguished guests in the academic sphere. One family friend of note was the man himself, J. Robert Oppenheimer. At the time of recording, Barbenheimer weekend is coming up, which is exciting. I will go learn more about Oppenheimer in this movie.
Yeah, I'm fascinated that, like, this anarchist figure was based on the creator of the atomic bomb, who said of himself, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds," and all that. I mean, he deeply regretted his decision. Spoiler alert for the movie, I guess.
Spoiler alert, it's a historical movie. Yes, Le Guin has cited her connection with Oppenheimer as kind of inspiration. She had him in mind while she was writing the character Shevek, who's the protagonist of The Dispossessed. And I think perhaps, like I said, I don't know a ton about Oppenheimer. Maybe it was a bit of that sense of regret that he had afterwards. Because when she was interacting with Oppenheimer in her youth, this was like, while this was all going on. So I feel like she's getting to see the complicated versions of him, but also makes sense. Like if you're writing a book about a physicist and she's including a lot of physics, she's probably thinking of, I don't know, maybe the most prominent physicists of the era that she happened to be like hanging out with in her home. But anyways, so for her tertiary education, she went to Radcliffe College, which is like the women's college at Harvard, and she graduated in 1951. She completed her master's in French at her father's alma mater, Columbia University, the following year. And then she began her PhD studies and won a Fulbright to France. While in France, she met a fellow Fulbright scholar, Charles Le Guin, who's an American. For a long time, I thought he was French because everything I read was like, in French, she met Charles Le Guin. And I was like, that's a French last name. He must be French. He was born in Georgia. So the two would marry in 1953, and she permanently paused her doctoral work once they were married. Together, they had 3 children and were married until Ursula's death in January of 2018. So that's on the personal front, the family relations. But let's talk about her writing career, which I did have to separate out because it's a lot. So as a young mother, Le Guin published her first piece, which was a poem, in 1959. She published a handful of other short stories and eventually a few novels, but she didn't get a lot of like mass market attention at first. I think her first novel was published in one of those like low cost printings where they put like 2-for-1 novels in one bound book.
Oh my God.
And at this point, she was writing a lot of realistic fiction, but set in this kind of fictional European country that she called Ursulas. And this is kind of like a theme of Le Guin's writing, where she creates a world and then she continues to revisit this world through a lot of different characters in a lot of different ways. It's not seen as a series where each book like goes in chronological order or follows a certain set of people at the same time, but just they all kind of interact in the same space. So she had her kind of blending of realism with this fictional place and culture. But eventually she decided for strategic marketing reasons to transition into science fiction. There was more money there. There was more of a market for her style of writing. And I think it was a savvy move. Like she was writing stuff that wasn't really garnering attention in the mass literary critical market. And so she kind of went into a side tangent. This is when she started writing the Hainish cycle, which the Dispossessed is part of this Hainish universe. You could think of it maybe like the Marvel universe, where sometimes they intersect with each other and you're like, oh, that character was in this other comic book series. But otherwise, a lot of these are standalone pieces. You don't need to read them in order. And at one point, a publisher invited her to write a young adult novel. And she had never done that before. And she was like, this is a challenge. I'll try it. Again, interesting that many notable parts of her career were based off of industry and marketing and publishers being like, this is what's hot in the market, or there's room for you here. And she wrote A Wizard of Earthsea, published in 1968, and this is what kind of launched her into celebrity. Her Earthsea books, which I've never read. Have you read any of those, Julia?
No, but they're supposed to be very good.
In the following year, 1969, she published the novel The Left Hand of Darkness, which this is what really solidified her reputation in the kind of adult sci-fi world. She won the Hugo and the Nebula for this book, and she was the first woman to win both of those awards for the same book, which I think only the year prior did someone win both of those. A man won both of those awards in the same year, so it wasn't very common at the time. So The Dispossessed came out in 1974, and this was the earliest chronologically in the Hain universe, the Hainish universe, but was the 5th or 6th, depending on how you're counting it. And she got another 1-2 punch Hugo Nebula awards for this one as well. Okay, so a little context on the Hainish cycle. It's set in a future history in which civilizations of human beings on different planets orbit a bunch of nearby stars. So they're like in solar systems kind of near each other, including Terra, which is what like the reader will identify as Earth. And they're contacting each other for the first time and establishing diplomatic relationships and setting up kind of a confederacy under the guidance of what is the oldest of the human worlds, the peaceful Hain, Hain. But in this universe, in this history of the world, human beings did not evolve on Earth, but were the result of interstellar colonies placed by the Hain some long time ago. But then there was a long period where interstellar travel and communication completely ceased. So it's like probably thousands of years since any of these groups of people have been in contact with each other. And so some of the races have new genetic traits. And that's a result of the ancient Hainish experimenting on genetic engineering. So in The Dispossessed, we see a people that has more hair, but they otherwise seem human in how they're described. And I thought this was really funny. Le Guin, commenting on discrepancies in her world building across the entire cycle, says, Consistency is an ideal for which I have only inconsistently striven.
Ah!
So sometimes she'll introduce an idea or a concept in one book that will never be seen again, or will be altered in a future book. But like she said, this was never intended to be a series. She just likes living in this world, and so she wrote a lot of books.
I feel the need to throw in something that we do not have time to fully get into, but this woman has incredible comebacks and is so sassy, and you need to go read all of her interviews. Victoria was sending me excerpts last night and I was dying.
Yeah. We'll link a fun one from The Guardian in 2004. I think I have one quote from that article in our show notes today, but there was so much in there I could not unpack. But yeah, go check that out if you want a little flavor of her sass. Okay, so what is The Dispossessed about?
The Dispossessed tracks 2 timelines in the life cycle of this physicist named, I've been calling him Shevek in my head. Victoria calls him Shevek. There are no rules. Who lives on an alien planet called Anaris, one of 2 in a kind of binary planetary system. Technically, Anaris is the moon, but it's more of a binary planet system. Its sort of pair, called Urus, is where he and his people being an anarchist society created around the ideas of a revolutionary woman named Odo. They're called Odonians. They came from this planet Urus about 200 years ago. Basically, the powers that be on Urus were all these anarchists, they're taking up too much space, and they're threatening to actually force us to change the way that we run our societies. And so we need to send them somewhere. And so they basically gave them the moon. It was a one-way deal. It was we'll send the people that we don't want to deal with to the moon, and they can establish a society there, and it'll be really hard because there's no resources, and then we will never have to deal with them again. Ha ha ha. Joke's on you.
Anaris was a mining colony already. They had set up short-term mining towns to mine resources from Anaris. Because I had the thought last night, I was how did they just arrive on this planet and make up all their technology? How did they survive? But I was oh, right. It had already been colonized by miners that were doing their short-term stints. And then this was you can take over the mines and send resources for trade with Urus. But anyways,
yeah, there was already some infrastructure there. They didn't just drop them on an empty moon and say, good luck!
One-way ticket to death.
Yeah. So, the first timeline, what I would consider the present, follows Shevek as a man in his 40s who volunteers to be the first Anaresti to go back to Urus to accept a physics award and teach some classes at the university there for a year. Ostensibly, that's the purpose. He enjoys the beauties of the planet, but he soon learns that he is being kept in a kind of gilded cage, bribed with comforts that he never experienced back home in order to get him to turn over this theory that they really want from him, which is essential to the development of a simultaneous communication device that the Aresti want to sort of develop before the rest of the planets. And his goal is to reestablish brotherhood and kind of communication between the 2 planets, because he thinks that this kind of extreme hatred and separation is just useless. But he realizes that he's been bought, basically. And he also realizes that they're trying to keep him away from the poor, oppressed people of the planet who are incredibly inspired by Anaris, and him in particular. He becomes this kind of figure. But eventually he does manage to find these people and helps lead a kind of peaceful protest, which is then broken up by police with machine guns. So he seeks amnesty at Terra's embassy and is granted passage back home. So he sort of fails in his mission in one way, but has sort of incited a lot of kind of movement there. And then the second timeline follows Shevek's upbringing on Anaris. So this is sort of the past timeline. We alternate between them chapter by chapter. And it sort of tracks the sequence of events in his adult life, which sort of led him to make the choice to leave the planet. Basically, his motivation is that we see the way that the anarchist ideals have been put into practice in a society, in which there's no ownership or money or centralized government, and everyone pitches in the best they can, and it's great, but also, these are people. And so as Shevek gets older, he and his friends and his partner, they get very frustrated with how stagnant their society has become, how safe. They don't want to take risks. They don't want to encourage too much individualism because they're trying to keep peace to survive in a way. There's been a kind of slow consolidation of power. Like, they don't really have law. Their law is societal pressure. But the societal pressure has gotten more and more tense to sort of not rock the boat, right? Because if we want to survive, we need everyone to just agree with, like, the lowest common denominator. And Shevek and his friends, his revolutionary tendencies start at home, and they want to kind of inspire their society to return to their anarchist roots, but they're not particularly popular, especially in their decision to communicate with and send Shevek to Urus. So he's sort of working on kind of simultaneous revolutions in these two timelines. And neither one is really brought to fruition. They're just kind of kick-started. And so at the end of the book, as Shevek comes back into view of Anars, he knows that there's a long way to go for both planets, but also that he has more friends than he expected. And so there's this kind of sense of hope, but that things are unfinished. So much of our discussion today is going to be led by sort of the ideas we had in our experiences reading. So I'm really curious what your experience was.
I knew basically nothing about Ursula K. Guin before reading this, except that was a name I should know. And honestly, for a while, I got her confused with the famous children's literature publisher, Ursula Nordstrom, for like an embarrassingly long amount of time, where I thought that, like, not only is this writer so prolific, but also had time for an incredible career publishing the likes of, like, E.B. White and Shel Silverstein, and made, like, a huge impact on American children's literature. And I was like, wow. That's crazy. But these are, in fact, two different Ursulas. So today we're talking about the author, Ursula K. Guin. But anyway, so the Dispossessed, you had suggested reading it. I was looking for more sci-fi, so I was like, this is great, and it'll be a good opportunity to read some older sci-fi. I read mostly contemporary, like things published in the last, like, 10 years.
Yeah.
So it was kind of a slow burn novel for me. I know that's usually something you say about a romance. It was not a romance novel, slow burn, but I just mean it took me a while to feel hooked into the plot. Mm-hmm. But what made it, like, so enticing was that I was so quickly hooked into the world and to the protagonist. Like, from chapter 1 or 2, I was already, like, blabbing to anyone who would listen to me about this book I was reading because I thought it was so fascinating. Mm-hmm. Like, imagine this planet, and they've been separated for, like, 200 years from the people they came from, and they've created this whole different society, and most people just kind of did like a, nice, Victoria, sounds cool. I started talking about it with my partner the other night over dinner, and as I was describing this book for a really long amount of time, he's like, I feel like you've talked to me about this book before. And I'm like, yeah, I think I've brought it up like every week that I've been reading this. But it did take me a while. It took me like 2 or 3 weeks. Gosh, 4 weeks to read this book. So it was really fascinating. A lot of interesting ideas. It made me think a lot about anarchism, which we'll get into. Mm-hmm. And was also just like delightful and surprising in so many ways. I didn't think I would enjoy reading physics as much as I did.
Yeah.
I have literally zero background in physics. I've never taken a physics course in my life. So I can't tell you where the actual science ends and this science fiction begins. Besides the interstellar travel. I understand we're not quite there yet.
Well, and it's not just physics, but like theoretical physics.
Yeah.
Like we're in like really heady territory. It should be much more difficult to comprehend than it is. Yeah. So I'd only read a short story of hers. And so I'd been meaning to read her novels forever. In more of like a vague sense, because I would always get her confused with Octavia Butler.
Same. That was also a confusion I would make.
But I had a particular motivation once I came to study anthropology because I learned about how Kroeber was her dad and her writings are super anthropological. And so I just kind of looked up like a top 10 list of her work, and this one came up a lot. I bought it in New York, but I kind of avoided it for a while because I thought it would be more difficult, like emotionally and ideologically and technically. I was a little, like, I didn't want to pick it up during like a high stress time because I thought it would be too much. And it was highly technical and ideological, but it went down so smooth and easy and lovely and fun, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It really took me by surprise. It probably helps that I had no expectations, but her world building is incredible, and The thing that makes my heart sing so much is how internally consistent it is. Like, there's inconsistencies between books, but internally, so consistent. And she provides all the details that an anthropologist would want to know, which was just very fun. Like, what are the normative logics and what's the history of the language and how does that impact how they think and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and it's given to you in such, like, digestible bites. It's
Yes.
not like pages describing the history of the people who created the Pravic language, which is the language they speak on Anaris. It's just, like, hinted at here and there, and, like, little notes about how it works and doesn't work, and which words they've actually borrowed from Iotic, which is the language of one of the states back on Urus that they are in communication with. Yeah, it was just fascinating too, especially when Shevek starts learning Iotic. It gives an opportunity to give a few more hints towards what he's learning, and it's very masterfully done. It's not just like, now I will explain how their water filtration system works for 4 pages.
I think having a timeline where we watch Shevek grow up was really, really smart because you get to see every single element of their society as it applies to his growth as a character and the plot development, but we then get to examine how each sort of facet operates. And so it gets explained in context and for a purpose, which is very, very smart. So we get kind of practical demonstrations of all of the ideas. And there are some scenes where they're just sitting around talking, but it's so engaging.
Yeah.
You're just like...
And she always has something going on in the room, too, when people are doing that, which I think is so masterfully done. I know I'm getting ahead of myself because you haven't finished your experience reading, but here we go. Like, there's a scene where some intense decisions are being made about Shevek potentially leaving Anaris for Urus, and he's with his partner, and they're a good friend, but also their young child, who's like an infant toddler. And so there's a lot of asides of the toddler, like, oh, we need to keep her awake. It's almost dinner time. And like, then the toddler is just like toddling away, or like, oh, everyone was so engaged in the discussion, they didn't realize the toddler fell asleep. Like, it's just like a little thing that makes it feel so human and alive. Like, that's how parents interact with their friends, which is constantly interrupted by taking care of their child, but also like still engaging in important conversations,
Yeah. Or there's that long scene where we get Shevek's theories on simultaneous time versus the passage of time. We'll get into it a bit later, but it's a very tense scene because there's a ton of stuff happening in the room, and he's having liquor for the first time in his life, and he doesn't realize he's kind of being drugged. Like, they're pumping him full of alcohol to like kind of control him. So there's like layers of political things happening, and there's a bit of dramatic irony as well. But then we're also getting these beautiful paragraphs on the paradoxes of how time operates. And it's like it's so well done. It was also something that we're going to talk about quite a bit. It was really fascinating to kind of travel back in time and imagine what was it like to read this book in 1974 when it came out. Because this is like after she had become really huge, right? Which I didn't even realize as you were explaining her timeline. So yeah, I'm really excited to read more and to kind of get into this book kind of in context, because it's so fascinating to think about all the layers of like what this book was doing in its time.
What did you know about anarchy? What did you think of anarchy before reading this book or when you were young?
Yeah, so when I was really young, I just thought because there's kind of a colloquial use in the States of like chaos or pandemonium, like, oh, it was total anarchy. You don't actually mean anarchy. Like, if you're using it to describe children, like, it's just chaotic. They don't have a political system. Maybe that is anarchy, then, actually.
The toddlers have no government. They have
no state. They're maybe that is a good description. And then I had seen it a little bit in context during sort of revolutionary points in other countries' histories. It was always used in a negative light of like, there's moments of anarchy, but anarchy always turns back into organized government and a lot of times into some kind of fascism. That was kind of how it was explained to me. But then I do remember being really, really surprised as an anthropologist reading a bunch of texts and realizing that the ones that I liked the best were considered anarchist anthropologists. And so that really shifted my worldview of it, and I think warmed me to the potentials of anarchy. And then maybe I have a little bit of it in me as well. Just a little bit.
I think my idea of anarchy was very much like the 90s punk, the A and the circle symbol, like etched into like the bathroom stall, you know, like rebellious teen is what I associated with anarchy. I hadn't really given it much serious thought as like an ideology and like the implications of it. I think I also, I mean, like you, grew up in the American schooling system where it is kind of taught as like, here are all the different government options. Look at democracy, capitalist democracy. Isn't it the best one? Like, anarchy was never painted in like a neutral or even positive light. And I guess maybe I wasn't paying attention enough or dug in enough, but I feel like anytime it came up in my like history or like literature classes, it was like a flavor, but not like a exploration, you know, and be like, oh, like Henry David Thoreau is often associated with the pacifist anarchists. Moving on now. Even though I studied Thoreau in college and stuff, I don't remember going deep into discussions about his views on pacifist anarchy, stuff like that. I think this, Le Guin's novel is probably the first time I really sat with this idea for like this long.
Yeah, one new thing I got from this book is the word archist. Apparently it just means someone with a government. I was like, what? I'm assuming it's the opposite of anarchist based on my knowledge of Latin prefixes, but never heard that word before.
It feels kind of leaning into this idea that like we don't need to define what we are, we just need to define the other, right? So like we point out the anarchists, but we won't say that we're archists because then that would put us on like a spectrum with anarchists on one end and anarchists on the other instead of like othering this ideology.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
I pulled a bunch of different quotes from the novel itself, but this is from the longer like impassioned speech that Chevette gives while he's part of the strikes on Urus. When he kind of is asked to give a speech, he talks about what anarchy is for him and the fellow anarchists. He says, "We have nothing but our freedom. We have nothing to give you but your own freedom. We have no law but the single principle of mutual aid between individuals. We have no government but the single principle of free association. We have no states, no nations, no presidents, no premiers, no chiefs, no generals, no bosses, no bankers, no landlords, no wages, no charity, no police, no soldiers, no wars. Nor do we have much else. We are sharers, not owners. We are not prosperous. None of us is rich. None of us is powerful. If it is the nourish you want, if it is the future you seek, then I tell you that you must come to it with empty hands. You must come to it alone and naked as the child comes into the world, into his future, without any past, without any property, wholly dependent on other people for his life. You cannot take what you have not given, and you must give yourself. You cannot buy the revolution. You cannot make the revolution. You can only be the revolution. It is in your spirit or it is nowhere."
I love that speech.
Yeah, because it's powerful, but also super realistic. You know, he spent time on both Anaris where he grew up, but also on Urus to see how they live. And he's saying like, you can't half-ass this. You know, you can't like the way of life on Anaris is not for everyone, especially if you are used to certain things.
It's not comfy.
Yeah, because it isn't on Anaris, right? You know, they live a very bare bones existence. It's a lot about survival. Everyone kind of pitches in and takes the jobs that need to be done, which means sometimes you take shit jobs because that's what you have to do. And we see a lot of this. There's a big stretch of Chevette's, I guess, like middle adult years where there's a famine on his planet. In summary, we're told of some really horrific things he lived through, of people starving and everyone pitching in, being separated from friends and partners to just go off and do what they can to like survive as a people. So it did not seem comfortable, you know? It's like he's surprised when he gets to Urus and the beds are like cushy and there's like giant bathrooms, which he calls like a throne room to the shit stool or something like that.
Yes!
Which is so funny.
So funny. Honestly, this speech reminded me a lot of Jesus.
Say more.
His whole thing about how, like, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. And, like you have to come to this brotherhood empty-handed. there's so many tie-ins that I was like, it's hard to know where the influence comes from. Like, is Le Guin, I mean, she wasn't raised with religion, right? So is she at all influenced by the Bible? Or is this pointing to the way that Jesus as a figure was actually kind of an anarchist in his own right? You know, it's interesting. That's not the main point of the discussion. But when I read this, I was like, bro, this sounds familiar.
She takes the Sermon on the Mount and she's like, what if we put this on an alien planet?
Yeah. And in the mouth of an anarchist, and no one would, no, maybe they won't notice.
Yeah. Like, I mean, there are some, I did not think this until you said this, but I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is such a Jesus vibes. He comes from this other place that people haven't had contact with in so many years. And he's like, I'm a representative of my people. Do you want to come, leave everything behind and follow me? Which he literally does with one of the other characters where he's like, it's not going to be easy. People will despise you, which is literally what Jesus said was like,
yes!
Oh my God. Mind blowing hand emoji. We'll get into some of the ways that Le Guin has herself written and shared in interviews about what influenced her. She did write a letter to the author Murray Bookchin. He wrote Post-Scarcity Anarchism, and she wrote to him saying, like, many of your philosophical and ecological concepts like really influenced me in writing The Dispossessed. She also, you found this bit while she talks about kind of how the Vietnam War and the broader Cold War influenced this, which I think is kind of my first thought while reading this. I was like, 1974, here's a society that's anarchist. The character goes to a capitalist society. And on that planet, one of the states is a capitalist society. Another state that we get like one character from and a little bit of mentions is more like a centrally controlled communist state. So there are kind of these very blatant capitalism versus communism themes.
Yeah, and there's some pretty direct statements from this really old academic who's so British coded, it's ridiculous. He's like, he lives in this estate and he's like, oh, my old chap.
Wait, what?
With his like hunting trophies and like the way he talks about war and how it makes you manly and just everything about him is so like, I am a British aristocrat. But the way that he talks about the war is very, very similar to how the Cold War sort of played out, where you have the sort of mostly the US, right, the capitalist country versus, they claimed it was versus the idea of communism. It was really just like anti-Russia. Or the Soviet Union, who's sort of represented by this other country called Thu. The way that the Cold War would play out is like they would never fight each other directly on each other's own soil. And I mean, Russia and the US pretty famously, you know, unconquerable large land masses. You know, there's a lot of jokes about how like, don't try to invade Russia, you will all die. So instead, like, they took out their aggression on wars happening on other countries. They would sort of co-opt small conflicts on other countries, like in Vietnam or Korea or Cuba, and they would sort of take out their aggression on each other there by backing opposite sides. And the exact same thing happens in the novel between Io and Thu, where they're waging a war on someone else's soil. So we get this quote from Le Guin about how her anger about the Vietnam War inspired this novel, where she says, "The Dispossessed started as a very bad short story, which I didn't try to finish, but couldn't quite let go. I needed to understand my own passionate opposition to the war that we were endlessly, it seemed, waging in Vietnam, and endlessly protesting at home." And then she has this very sassy aside, which I enjoy. "If I had known then that my country would continue making aggressive wars for the rest of my life, I might have had less energy for protesting that one."
Girl, I love Le Guin.
Oh, how tired we are. She continues, "But knowing only that I didn't want to study war no more, I studied peace. I started by reading a whole mess of utopias and learning something about pacifism and Gandhi and nonviolent resistance. This led me to the nonviolent anarchist writers such as Peter Kropotkin, who's Russian from 1800s, and Paul Goodman, With them, I felt a great immediate affinity. They made sense to me in the way Lao Tzu did, who's an ancient Chinese Taoist. So that's sort of where the kernel of this book came from, and kind of the ideas that she was sort of wrestling with. And it also kind of tells you about like the cultural soup that she was sort of contending with as she was writing this book, which were all of these social movements that we think of with the 60s and 70s.
What makes me appreciative of Le Guin and curious to read more of her work is that she seems very honest and open about how her study of the world, it never stopped and it continued to influence her writings. And so there's all this kind of like the cultural soup that we're living in, right? These things going on. And some of it she can point to as like, yeah, I was actually really interested in, you know, the study of peace because of the Vietnam War. And these are exact things I read. And there's other things that just seem to be like floating in the ether, but maybe she explored more thoroughly later on in her life. And some of these are very present in The Dispossessed and others are kind of like hinted at. So yeah, I found it interesting that she actually, as much as I think this book is like a feminist novel on my first read, she didn't really dig into feminist theory until later in her life. It was just a few years after this novel, actually. But she was kind of critiqued in some of her early writing by feminist writers for not being feminist enough or not kind of ignoring some problematic things in her books. Notably, she writes a lot from male perspectives. And at one point she said cheekily, like, I needed to get in the brain of an alien, and the only way I know how to do that is through a man, which is adorable. But also, she admits that, like, she just didn't have a way in to write as a woman, not just, like, being in her body, but to write in the voice of a woman. So in 94, she gave an interview referring back to 1977-78, where she was kind of commissioned to write a science fiction novel for a feminist collection. And so it needed to have a female protagonist, and she was really struggling. And so she writes, I blundered around a while and then found some guidance in feminist theory. I got excited when I discovered feminist literary criticism was something I could read and actually enjoy. I read the Norton Book of Literature by Women from cover to cover. It was a Bible for me. It taught me that I didn't have to write like an honorary man anymore, that I could write like a woman and feel liberated in doing so. Le Guin gave a commencement speech in the 80s at a university, and it's like such a fantastic speech, but it's mainly her speaking to the women in the room about like being liberated and empowered to write, to work, to live as a woman and not in the systems of men. And I think especially as a science fiction writer breaking into the scene in the 60s, like she was really pressured to write like a man, to make her books fit the current market. And so this was kind of a journey for her. And I think I still see feminists, like the cultural influence of the feminist movement, second wave feminism in The Dispossessed. We see that stark contrast between how women are treated as the kind of an inferior gender on Urus, and on Anaris, gender is present, but not really a question of what like men and women can and cannot do. I think there's more progressive ways she could have written about gender. It's still very binary in this specific book, but she actually has other writing where she writes about these androgynous beings that kind of determine their sex at different points during their life.
Yeah, it's so interesting to see her kind of continue to grow. It feels like, from everything we've learned about her, that she's sort of using each book to sort of deal with something that she takes issue with, or something that she's dealing with inside, or her own, you know, trying to wrestle and come to some kind of conclusion about how she feels. And like, you can see the fire in her in this book to, like, you can see, I think what you can feel is her frustration with the limitations of gender, but maybe she doesn't have all the language yet of feminist theory necessarily, right? So like second wave feminism is happening around her, so she's probably absorbing some of these changes in gender roles that she's seeing, but you can tell like it hasn't fully solidified for her, you know, exactly what she thinks about gender, but that she's very frustrated with how it currently is and kind of the limitations it's put on her, because she, you know, as you quoted, like she felt so liberated by reading feminist theory, and it was like, you can feel her looking for it. So we talked about the way that the Cold War and its sort of sub-wars, the Cold War and the wars that they were carrying out or getting themselves involved in other smaller countries, that is a very obvious reference to what was happening currently in her era. But there's also another one that we literally landed on like 2 hours ago.
Yeah. I know, when you texted me like, oh my gosh, the Berlin Wall. I was like, duh. Yeah, so there's literally a wall in this novel. We open on a wall. The very first sentences of this book are, for 7 generations, there had been nothing in the world more important than that wall. Like all walls, it was ambiguous, two-faced. What was inside it and what was outside it depended upon which side you were on. On one side of the wall, we have, quote, enclosed the universe, leaving Anaris outside, free. But looking at it from the other side, quote, the wall enclosed Daenerys, the whole planet was inside it, a great prison camp, cut off from the other worlds and other men in quarantine. Which, wow, the word quarantine I think will trigger me for the rest of my life. Yeah. But yeah, that's where we open in the novel, is this idea of like, what is inside, what is outside? Like there's a wall around basically the landing pad where the ships from Eurus come. They stop, they take off cargo, they put on cargo, they go back. Like no one from Eurus is allowed past the walls into Anaris, and no one from Anaris is allowed in unless you work for like the few people that work taking shifts, helping unload and load cargo. And it's this really kind of binary inside-outside kind of thinking that we start with. And then we get Shevek because he's starting to question these walls. And later in the novel, he says, those who build walls are their own prisoners. I'm going to go fulfill my proper function in the social organism. I'm going to go unbuild walls. Which is interesting to say unbuild, not tear down.
It has a more productive connotation, I think.
Yeah.
It's so funny to me how I missed... It's such like a central ongoing metaphor where like, I mean, the first sentence is literally, there was a wall. That's sentence number 1. And then he's constantly, as you quoted in his language, is constantly referring to literal and ideological walls that he's trying to break down because he's basically like, we are anarchists. We're supposed to be constantly sort of remaking and undoing and shaking up our own society and our own thinking, and yet we have set this very hard and fast boundary between ourselves and Urus, who we came from, right? And there's a bunch of people on Urus who are incredibly oppressed and who look to us for support and who need our help, and we respond from trauma, essentially, but from fear and hatred, real hatred that comes from that fear and trauma. Shevek is trying so hard to sort of blur that border. And by the end of the book, he's really only just started. And it's unclear whether it will ultimately be successful, right? He's sort of got the processes going in a way on both planets. And so I'm like, oh my God, 70s, communism versus capitalism, a wall, like literally the symbol of kind of the Iron Curtain idea. And like, it's like the one physical place where you can actually see an artifact that separates. It's like the only place where you can see the conflict. And I don't know, it was really fascinating to kind of think back on, like, if you were someone reading this in the time, right? The Berlin Wall has not been torn down. You don't know that it's going to be, right? You're like, we can look back on this and be like, oh, that was like the symbol of this time period, and look at what happened, and we can go visit artifacts of it. I was just in Berlin a couple weeks ago, and you can like go see these sort of artifacts that are now memorialized. But at the time, there was no sense that any of this conflict would ever end, because it just kept being carried out in these different countries, and there was this sort of wall that people died trying to cross, and there was a sense of like, who's being kept in and who's being kept out. We were shown the image of this wall as like keeping the bad out, but there's always two sides of a wall. I don't know, I feel like thinking about that symbol, I don't know, it puts me in a time and place of like experiencing what would this novel be like at the time.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about like this book being written in a world where you don't know what happens yet. with things like the Cold War and the Berlin Wall, and a call for hope was like really exciting. I can see why this was like not only award winning in its writing, but often a lot of awards are given to novels that are just grappling with like the present day issues in interesting ways. And yeah, it's such an interesting perspective to try to like wrap my brain around. We don't know what the future holds. It's 1974, what's going on. It's been fascinating too, like doing this research on like countercultural movements, what was happening in the 60s and 70s. And like 68 was a wild year, especially when it comes to civil rights. It's the year MLK was assassinated. There was lots of riots. There was, I think, the Chicago 9. Did that happen in 68?
Oh.
Like so much happened in 68. And that was also the year my dad was born. And like thinking about how this seems to be a common conversation whenever anything is happening in the world, which is always of like, who could have a kid during this time? You know, like, is there it's the Cold War. It's like, are my children going to die by nuclear disaster? Should I even have kids? And I think of a lot of the discussion during the pandemic and even continuing now, like with climate change and whatnot, like, should we even have kids? Should we have a future? And I think books like these make me think about how can we embrace hope without turning a blind eye to the realities of our world. And I think when science fiction offers that, it offers an idea of like, how can we think of our society in different ways? It maybe take a revolutionary act to make these kind of changes, but like if we can imagine a different place, like that's kind of our role. And she actually said this in a speech. She was awarded some sort of like Lifetime Achievement Award equivalent by the National Book Award in 2014. And she, this is what she said. "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, and very often in our art, the art of words." But yeah, it just kind of speaks to like the power of art and the written word to keep pushing forward ideas of hope, ideas of change, ideas of what if our life was different. Ideas of let's remember when things were like this. How are they still that way? How are they not that way anymore? Because we started out mentioning the subtitle of this book refers to an ambiguous utopia. We haven't even talked about utopia too much, but I think that's something that makes this novel like kind of a staying power and so fascinating is that I think you said this first, she's complicating a utopia and she's making it very human.
When I saw that she was starting to critique Anaris through her characters and like was kind of setting up this binary of like the archists and the anarchists and collectivism versus individualism, I was really nervous that she was going to try and cater too much to what I imagine is an American audience would be pretty capitalist, right? I was worried she was going to kind of water down her message, or that she was going to do the kind of classic dystopian thing like you have in The Giver, right? Where you have a collectivist society that seems perfect, but it's eerie and it's creepy. And so one child discovers that the whole thing is super messed up and actually he has to escape or tear the whole thing down or something, right? I was worried she was going to go that route. And instead what she does is she makes Anaris human, right? This is a traumatized group of people who built an entirely new society based on a book and a movement, right, that had been ongoing for several years. It wasn't like a brand new idea. Like people have been putting into practice for a while. But people putting ideas into practice is messy. When you get the raw materials of like, here, create a new society, they created a new language. Like they restarted everything, and it's gonna be messy, you know? A group of people that size, public opinion is not something you can predict or control, you know? You just have to poke at it and push it. And in fact, her main character's sort of invocation at the end is a call to return to the original sort of anarchism their society was founded on, and being like, hey guys, so I think we're centralizing our power a little too much because we're afraid. And I think we need to remember our roots and be like, look back on Odo's original words and see, okay, in our time right now, what does anarchism look like now? What do we have to push back against now. Because when it was originally formed, we were pushing back against Urus, and so we were trying to create a new society that was not Urus, right? But now that we have a society that's operating somewhat imperfectly, now we have something of our own to push back against. And now we have this barrier between us and them that we've artificially constructed out of fear. And so now we have new things to break open. So can we reapply those original ideas to the present? I was so impressed by that. And I think that's why this book holds up so well.
Mm-hmm.
We get a quote from author David Mitchell about this book.
Yeah.
Where he says, dystopias are a piece of cake to write, but utopias usually die of implausibility by page 5. Le Guin's trick is to build hers from the same crooked timber as our world. It's just a very poetic way of saying what I just said.
I agree. In the back of my copy of The Dispossessed is a study guide, and the study guide kind of points out that by the end of World War II, utopians as a writing form have gone out of style, very understandably. Yeah, this was kind of not a new idea to write a utopia, but a very unexpected form of writing during this time. And I think even now still, we do get a lot of dystopian fiction that, like you said, with The Giver, or I think of Hunger Games, it's fun as a young adult. It kind of maybe fits the young adult anarchist trope of push against the man, let's do this thing. Yeah. And I'm a teenager and now I'm in charge of a social movement.
Well, and it kind of mirrors the experience of the loss of innocence.
Yeah.
That you experience at that age. Yeah.
It works really well for the coming of age kind of novel, revealing back. But in all those, it's kind of revealed that there's a larger power at play. Mm-hmm. So especially in The Giver, which definitely starts out in this utopian idea, it's revealed that, there's people behind all this making decisions to build a utopia and to sit in it and to not reveal the curtain that someone else is behind it. And even it's a pretty big discussion between Shavak and his friends, especially the ones that are a bit more revolutionary than him earlier on in the novel, is he's like, who are they? You keep saying they are trying to control us, or they are trying to stifle individuality. Who's they? And his revolutionary friends, it's not there's a cabal of people, a secret society controlling everything, the Illuminati behind it all. Instead, it's no, it's because we're so collectivist and governed by social pressures, we have built ourselves a set of social pressures that are now stifling the original ideas of Odonianism. The whole group is pushing back against the idea of these social mores having more power over the people than the actual people themselves. Which I don't even know if I should use the word power, because doesn't he say in his speech, we have no power. There is no power in our society.
Yeah. Well, it's a very anthropological definition of power and law, which is just law is anything that has become normative through repetition and expectation. So it does not have to be written down. It does not have to be spoken. It just has to be an expectation in a way that it becomes a social pressure. It becomes internalized. Shavak even confronts Takver, his partner, about this, where he's like, we keep saying that we have the power to reject a job placement. And how do you know anyone who has? Has anyone ever rejected a job placement? None of us have, because it's not something anyone does. No one does because no one does. Mm-hmm. That's a kind of law, and that's a kind of power that we all sort of collectively place on each other. And it's interesting to examine that in a positive light, because I feel like in the US, we pretend that doesn't happen, right? We pretend that we as individuals are completely free, and I as an individual can do anything I want. And that's just blatantly not true.
Which leads me into the final thing I wanted to talk about, which is
yes,
is how this book holds up today. Why does this book still resonate with us as readers? And I think what you highlighted is a big part of it, is that we still live in a social order. This book is about social order. Therefore, it is fascinating to think about how these fictional social orders do or do not resemble our society, kind of playing with ideas is like fun. So even if the technology is out of date, which I think is one of my like, one reason I never really got into what is called quote unquote hard science fiction is that if the technology gets out of date and the technology is the focus of the book, is it interesting anymore? In my opinion, not very interesting. Instead, I much prefer science fiction that is playing with social ideas, because even though this society has in the Dispossessed has a very primitive computer system. Like they have computers that literally just like place people in jobs, and it's like, ooh, the future. It makes decisions for us. But who is the computer? Who's running the computer? And they never really get into it. But the discussion of social order is in so many ways like still incredibly relevant. And we can hold it up as a window into exploration of the Cold War of the 70s and science fiction. We can also hold it up as an exploration of social dynamics and like anti-capitalism in the 2020s, you know?
Yeah. I mean, this book felt incredibly prescient as we are literally watching. So last week at the time of recording, the SAG-AFTRA, the Actors Guild just went on strike in addition to the Writers Guild strike. They are on strike together in solidarity for the first time in 60 years since around the time that this book was written, actually. And there's a lot of discussion about how these particular strikes are going to have wider reaching impacts because they are going to ultimately remove our distractions, right? Because that's part of how you keep an oppressed society under control, as you distract it with shiny objects like TV shows. It's really cool and really interesting. And I'm very excited to see how this plays out.
This is definitely one of those things where I'm curious to be 50 years out, like we are from publication of this book, and being like, ooh, little did Julie and Victoria know this is where the future went. Or like they were spot on, or like they had no clue.
They had no idea what they were in for. And also this book holds up because I think we're still, like, the work of the 60s and 70s was incomplete, and in some ways was rolled back in the 80s with a lot of reactionary policies in the US and UK in particular that set us back.
Yeah, which we are feeling again now. I mean, so much of history and politics is cyclical, of a lot of the progress we made in when was Roe v. Wade? It was a while back, but that was rolled back just recently. A lot of pressure to push back progress on LGBTQ plus rights. And we're seeing this kind of like pendulum swing a little bit. And yeah, I think that's what keeps this book fresh too, because the discussion of feminism, it's different in many ways between the book and today, but like not completely outdated. Also, I think we're still close enough to the 70s that the idea of women being barred from like teaching at universities is not a wild concept. You know, even the author herself went to like a women's college, and like her and her mother both stopped their formal education towards doctorate degrees because they both got married. Like that was just like, that was illuminating to me to learn about and think about the writing she was writing only, 15 years after she stopped her doctorate work, but still 50 years ago from today, where it's still not completely unnormal for a woman to stop their education because of the pressures of being a wife and a mother.
Some of the statements from the Ionic people, the men in the university, felt so jarring to me, where they were talking about how, with a perfectly straight face, we're talking about how women are kind of ornamental and, they get in the way of doing important work. They're distractions. They are only suited to repetitive work because they're so docile and they can't really think for themselves. And like just some really out-of-pocket statements. And then I had to think about like women reading this in 1974. Like, this is probably what they were taught, right? Like they were born in like the 40s and 50s, the women who might be reading this in their young to mid-adulthood. This is what they would have been taught by their mothers and by their schools. And like, this was the kind of femininity my mother was up against when she was out getting multiple degrees in the 70s. I don't know. Yeah, I guess ultimately it's very interesting to grapple with in some ways how relevant this book is, and in some ways how outdated at the same time.
Yeah, and when I first finished the book, I was a little disappointed because I wanted to see what happened next. Because we have Shevek looking out the window of the spaceship, arriving back on his planet with this hopeful mentality. He has gotten word that there are more people supporting him now than when he left. But I think it really works, and I think that's what the staying power is. If he had gone back and had this triumphant return, or if he was like shot down as he landed, like, well, they didn't have guns. If he was knifed down as they landed, it would have given a very definitive end to this story. Yeah. Whether it was a success or a failure. And I think leaving this book on the brink of change, which is kind of where we start the book, which is on the brink of change, at the spark of revolution, is what keeps this book so relevant. Because it can it give us a space to play with ideas, to consider what is a revolution and what revolutions do we want in our world and our society without being so didactic as to give an answer. So to my former self that was disappointed with the ending, we come a long ways. We come around to it by the end of an episode of like, the ending was actually pretty decent. I liked it.
What really struck me is how many audience surrogates there were in the last like 3 chapters, particularly the literal Earthling, right? The Terran ambassador, who Shevek gives this very impassioned speech to, and then the sort of recruit, the Hainish recruit who's driving the ship that's taking Shevek back home, who wants to join him. And he's telling them, like, it's going to be really hard, and you have nothing, you're gonna have to start from scratch. And we get some very direct statements and a kind of scathing critique through the mouth of the Terran ambassador about how our planet, Earth, has been destroyed through exploitation of the planet. She's like, it's habitable, but it's miserable. And so in order to conserve resources, we just have one giant government. So she just cannot conceive of like an anarchist society. And so we get these sort of audience surrogates at the end who receive these sort of calls to action. And then we have this open-ended ending that sort of leaves the reader, the Earthling reader, with this question of like, what will you choose? What are you going to do now? And it really worked for me. I felt like it was really powerful. And I think, it gives it a lot of staying power. And it makes you think.
So closing out recommendations, if you enjoyed The Dispossessed, go read some more Ursula K. Le Guin. She has so much. She had a prolific career. I didn't think I said this in the opening bit, but she basically wrote all the way through the 90s. She was still active in the literary community in the 2000s and published some as well. Got a huge collection of writing. She wrote so much in her lifetime. Some other books I'm looking forward to reading. Octavia Butler. I requested an Octavia Butler on my library's e-reader app and immediately was like, I have too many books to read right now, and I had to return it. So I do want to go read some Octavia Butler. I want to read Margaret Atwood. I still haven't read any of her stuff. Feels like also overdue, but there's so much time. And there probably won't be much television coming out for a while.
Yep.
So I'll be watching a lot of K-dramas and reading a lot of books.
Yep.
What would you recommend?
This book made me think of so many things. Babel by R.F. Kuang, which we talked about very recently, related to labor and strikes and stuff. It made me think of Elena Ferrante and like 70s feminism and the way that played out in Italy, which was a bit different than the US. Made me think of Joan Didion, particularly Slouching Towards Bethlehem. It also made me think of Madeleine L'Engle's work. Just in general, there's just a kind of flavor of sci-fi that it feels similar to me. Yeah, so lots of options of different directions you could go.
Okay, our final segment of the show, Currently Obsessed, things that are bringing us joy. I have been watching The Secret Chef on Hulu, which I read like a scathing review of on some TV review website, and I was like, shut up, it was the best show I've watched all year. Just kidding. The Bear season 2 was better. But Secret Chef is a reality cooking show. It's delightful. It's crazy. Maybe even a good recommendation if you like a bit of chaos. If you're just like up for some chaotic reality television that's not dramatic, as in the people are mean to each other, but like the show is just crazy. Like you can never know what to expect next, which is really weird in like a competition style reality show where like it's usually the same thing every episode, just less people.
It's fun.
I've been listening to The Retrievals, which is a New York Times and Serial podcast, a series that follows women who received treatment at the Yale fertility clinic. You might have heard the news story. I won't spoil it because I think they do a really good job turning the mystery on you in the first episode. I knew nothing, but I listened to the trailer because Spotify was like, you might like this show. And I was like, do you know me that well, Spotify? Would I like this show? And then I'm like, you're right. I do like this show. Stunning piece of podcasting work. I'm also currently obsessed with a side table that I found in the alley. I told Julia I was on a walk questioning if I have any desires in life. What are those just like existential, like, what do I really want out of life? I don't know. And then I saw this piece of alley furniture and I was like, I want to take this home and fix it up. And so I got my little red wagon and wheeled this side table home. And I'm in the process of redoing the top and like, I don't know, maybe do something fun to the handles or the shelf on the inside, but we'll see. The enemies to lovers plot of my summer has been Galvanina Italian soda. If you listen back a few episodes, I was like, I shouldn't like this, but I did. It's not truly lemonade. Why do I like it? I hate it. I've had it 4 times now. I love it. It's my special treat drink. It's way too pricey at my corner market, but I don't know where else to get it because it's imported from Italy, and I'm not about to like buy 1,000 of these sodas like a retailer and ship them to my house. The Galvanina has stolen my heart.
You mentioned Secret Chef chaotic television. Another chaotic, not really a reality show, not really a competition show, very hard to describe, but I've recommended before. It's called Taskmaster. It's from the UK.
I need to watch this. It sounds like my thing.
It's totally your thing. It's totally your thing. It's where comedians are required to do increasingly bizarre tasks in it. But the thing that's really hard to describe is like the tone of like the music and the set design and the humor of the show is like very, very particular, and it's just a delight. Okay, and then there's a ton of new music. So there's a new album from Mr. Wives, there's a new album from Paris, and The Japanese House. Japanese House is like from 2 months ago, but I forgot to mention it. And I just know that Hozier's new album is coming so soon. I can smell it. He's been dropping singles. He's taking his sweet time, but it's coming. And Barbenheimer tomorrow!
It's happening. I'm seeing 2 more movies that I usually see in a month tomorrow, which is both of them. And I'm really excited. I have my pink pants picked out, but we'll see how it goes. I might also be so exhausted from movies that I will not watch in the movie for 4 months.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little nervous for you specifically. I'm not gonna lie.
My partner has AMC, what is their like subscription thing? AMC A-list. And so that means popcorn refills, low-cost snacks. This girl is going to be in her happy place with a giant thing of Coke and a bunch of popcorn and a little break to do some stretches in the lobby between movies. I considered an outfit change, but that seems too extreme for how little I care about either of these movies. I actually have more anticipation and interest in this movie now that I know that the person Oppenheimer was a model on which Chevette was written.
Yeah. So much more investment now.
Yeah, I have so much more investment than I did earlier, which was just the shits and giggles of going to 2 movies in a row with a group of friends.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to Book Club with Julia and Victoria. We would love to hear your thoughts on this book or the topic we discussed, so you can share your review and recommendations with us on Instagram at BookClubWithJV, on our website, bookclubwithjv.com, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also visit our website for show notes with links to all of the recommendations and the things bringing us joy. If you don't already, go ahead and follow us on whichever podcast platform you are listening on so that you can be notified when our next episode is released. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Rebecca Gasme provides us with project management support. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick, and our logo was designed by Gabby Fabland. Until next time, happy reading.